Why would a healed man ask for 2 mule-loads of dirt? And why would a prophet of God tell him, go in peace, right after he admits he's going to bow down in a pagan temple? The story of Naaman ends with something strange, something weighty and dusty and holy. And it might just hold a deeper clue to what it means to worship faithfully, even today, in a rather complicated world. Welcome back to Bible Curio, the podcast that explores the hidden treasures in Scripture, the ones tucked into footnotes, the overlooked details, and the odd little moments that we often read right past. I'm your host, Tyler Jimerson, and today's episode is about dirt, specifically 2 mule-loads of it. We're talking about Naaman's boxes today, and a story I'm almost certain you probably never heard of, right? Now, I want to give you just a little bit of the context of what's happening. The story we're looking at is in 2 Kings chapter 5, and there's a lot that a context can teach us about why this story is important. You see, in the midst of faithless Israel, in the midst of many stories of kings and peoples not being faithful to God, all of a sudden, smack dab in the middle of that history, is a spotlight being shown on a pagan general and his faith towards Yahweh and his sort of baptism, in a way, in the Jordan River. Naaman is the name of this foreign military commander. He's powerful. He's decorated. He's deeply admired. But, and there's always a but in the story, beneath the medals and the reputation is this quiet devastation that is wreaking havoc on Naaman's life. You see, because the Bible tells us in 2 Kings chapter 5 that Naaman is a leper. He has leprosy. He is a man with power, everything at his beck and call, and yet he doesn't have the cure. He doesn't have the one thing that he wants. His story, in an allegorical way, is similar to all of our stories, right? We always have a but. Until he hears about this prophet in Israel. Now, the prophet is Elisha, and we've been learning about his ministry after the days of Elijah the prophet. So he goes on this long journey, and he's told basically to take this humbling dip in the Jordan River. It's not a great river. It's not a river from his homeland. It's just this little dinky river in Israel, and he accepts it. He goes, and suddenly he is miraculously made clean. He's healed. But that's not the end of the story. That's not even the weirdest part of the story that I really hope to focus our eyes on today. After thanking Elisha, the prophet who facilitated his miracle, Naaman makes a really weird request. We're told in verse 17 of 2 Kings chapter 5 this: "If you don't accept my gift, then please let your servant be given 2 mule-loads of earth. For your servant will no longer offer burnt offerings or sacrifice to any god, but Yahweh the Lord." So, 2 mule-loads of dirt. And then he says something even more curious. "It'll be that whenever my master goes into the temple of Ramon to worship there," now Ramon was like the local tribal deity of his people, "when he goes into the temple of Ramon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bowed down myself in the temple of Ramon, may Yahweh the Lord pardon your servant in this matter." So he's basically saying, when I go into this temple to tend to my duties as the grand general of this army, serving my king, and he goes into this false god's temple to bow down to it, I'm going to have to kneel down with him. And when that happens, please, will God forgive me? And Elisha's response is, "Go in peace." Wait. What? All right, let's start with the obvious question. What's with the dirt? Now, there are different interpretations on this story, and I don't think you'll be able to really solidify any one over the other very well. I have my own theories. But in the ancient world, what we have to first understand is that gods were understood to be territorial. They were tribal deities. If you were a people, you had your own god, right? It was like having your own mascot. The gods of Egypt lived in Egypt. The gods of Aram lived in Aram. The God of Israel, well, he lived in Israel, right? And so to worship a god properly, you had to be on that god's land. That was the perspective of all the ancient peoples. So Naaman, this freshly converted, committed to worshiping, the God of Israel now because he was healed by the God of Israel, he gets it in his mind that he wants to take a piece of that sacred land promised to Abraham. He's going to take that with him. And what we're seeing here is not superstition. Okay, I know the temptation is strong to say that, but it's reverence. He's trying to carry the ground of his healing, the soil of the salvation that he found, right? He's trying to take that home with him so that even in a pagan land, he can kneel on holy ground. Now, there are other interpretations that maybe, he was using that dirt to build an altar to God, right, in accordance with some of the commandments we find in Exodus. There are different ideas. But he's going to need it because his job is accompanying the king into the temple of Rimmon, this false god. Public duty demands that he helps his king in this private devotional matter. And he's saying to Elisha, the prophet of this god, I'm not worshiping Rimmon anymore, but I will be kneeling in Rammon's house, in his temple. And see, that's probably why for us this story is a little confusing. It's a little uncomfortable. It gets a little murky than maybe we want our waters to be. Naaman anticipates the dilemma, and he confesses it openly to Elisha. He's totally honest. I'll be kneeling in the temple I don't believe in. Please may Yahweh pardon me. And in Elisha, right, instead of issuing some kind of purity rebuke or outlining 5 points of the dangers of syncretism and compromise and basically castigating Naaman for being wishy-washy, he just simply says, go in peace. And that line stops me every time. Because Naaman is not trying to compromise, even though it might look like that. I see Naaman as trying to be faithful in tension. Faithful in tension. His life is complicated. He has to continue serving in the role in which he's serving. But his heart is clear. And apparently that's enough for Elisha. It's more than enough for God. I mean, you have to ask the question, if God didn't want to confuse us, why did he put this story inside the Bible at all, right? Because it is kind of confusing. And then there's something hauntingly beautiful about Naaman's boxes. These little boxes of dirt, right? I know this sounds weird, but they kind of remind me weirdly of Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? I just finished reading that. And in the novel of Dracula, the great titular vampire decides to ship boxes of Transylvanian soil with him to England. So you can imagine Dracula on this boat going to England, and with him, the only cargo he has is just like tons of boxes of Transylvanian soil. And why? Why does he do that? So he can rest on his native ground. It's eerie, but it's also kind of familiar. Because like Dracula, Naaman wants to remain connected to the ground that gave him life. There's a sort of sacred logic happening in the story. Whether we're talking about vampire or prophet, ancient minds understood that soil carries a story, soil carries an identity, soil carries a presence. And that's really hard for us moderns to grasp, I think. I'm actually reading a book right now by Rod Dreher, and it's called Living in Wonder. I thoroughly recommend it. It's been very interesting. It's one of those rare books that can blend history with theology and just show you things you never considered before. It's called Living in Wonder. The subtitle is Finding Mystery and Meaning in a Secular Age. And the reason why Dreher is writing this book is that for those of us who are living in the secular West, we've grown disenchanted with the world, right? And he cites the history behind all of this. He goes through this whole range of things that had to happen, these dominoes that had to fall to bring us to this place where we're grossly disenchanted with physical reality, to the point that, we even say ourselves are so separate from material that we can separate gender from our biological sex. I mean, that's where we are now. But it all begins with, the scholastics in the Middle Age, eventually moving to separating the natural world from the supernatural. And once we made that divide, the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, all those things only furthered that schism in our minds, that there's something different from natural and supernatural. And so now We think everything can be explained through the material. And we have a very disenchanted life. We don't see anything supernatural about soil, right? But Naaman's dirt isn't a souvenir. It's a sanctuary. And I can't help but picture him years later in his own home, spreading out that soil, kneeling on it and praying. Perhaps the only man in Aram bowing to the invisible God of Israel on a piece of Israel itself. And most of us don't carry dirt around in boxes. But I think this story actually does have some application for us today because we do live like Naaman, right? We've had encounters with God, however we want to define that, whether through the reading of scripture and some passage just particularly convicts us, felt like, God was speaking directly to us that day, or, healing moments, answers to prayers, baptism, your baptism, right? The tearful prayers that you've had. And then we return to what? Lives that are complicated. Lives that aren't black and white so often. Workplaces that aren't holy. Relationships that don't make room for God. Cultures that bow to other gods entirely. I have a story about the time I went to my grandmother's funeral on my Vietnamese side, and attending a Buddhist funeral is a very strange thing for me, who, was born and grew up in the Western world and was unfamiliar with the gongs and the chanting and different things that are happening, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do in that moment. We try, like Naaman, to carry sacredness with us, and so we show up in these secular spaces with consecrated hearts. We live, simply put, in cultures of Ramon, but we bow on boxes of grace. We, like Naaman, fumble toward faithfulness. Not always clean, but deeply sincere. And maybe, just maybe, one of the reasons why this story is told is because God sees it. Now, we can say at least that one of the reasons this story is told is to serve as a rebuke for unbelieving Israel. That's why it's spotlit in the middle of 2 Kings. Maybe the real miracle in this story isn't just Naaman's healed skin. Maybe it's about the God who makes space for the gray. The God would rather have a conflicted but devoted Naaman than a proud, unbending Israel. And I think we can at least say that Jesus thought so, because he brings this up. He brings up the story of Naaman in Luke chapter 4 in a story that actually nearly gets him thrown off a cliff. So apparently they still have hard feelings about that story being mentioned in the Bible, right? That in the midst of unbelieving Israel, there is even still a Gentile willing to proclaim that this is the God that I will serve. Because he dared say that God's healing didn't reach any of his own people, but to a foreigner. Naaman's boxes, I think, are a rebuke. Not because he was dirty, but because he came back clean. So picture it. A war hero, a leper once, now healed, bowing quietly on a little square of holy dirt. Perhaps he brought that with him in his pocket every time he had to accompany his master into the temple of Ramon, and he would lay out the holy dirt of Israel on the ground that he might kneel upon it, because in his heart he was truly bowing before the God of Israel, surrounded by idols, but praying to the one true God, with whom he had an encounter and by whom he was healed. Not perfect, but pure in heart. Or maybe that's what it means to live after a miracle. Not in safety or simplicity, but in this sort of faithful tension, right? With your hand on the sacred ground and a heart that says there is no God but in Israel. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope that you'll go back and recap on some of the older episodes that maybe you've missed. Last week we came out with one about the interesting question of why Joseph never wrote home, despite all the power he had. And we kind of dove into that topic together to try to find some answers. I think you'll find that the Bible is more interesting than maybe we ever give it credit for. And so hopefully Bible Curio can help you do that.